Welcome, everybody, to our live webinar, 9/11, An Architect's Guide, a three-part series. Today is Thursday, March 11th, 2021. I'm Richard Gage, AIA, member of the American Institute of Architects and founder of Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth. We're a 501c3 nonprofit organization representing a growing body of now more than 3,400 architects and engineers signed on to the petition demanding a new investigation into the destruction of all three World Trade Center skyscrapers on 9/11. Last week, we presented part one, World Trade Center Building 7. This is part two, the Twin Towers' explosive destruction, in which we'll be examining the explosive evidence and the structural dynamics of how the Twin Towers collapsed. First, let me introduce you to our operations manager, Andy Steele. Hi, Andy. And don't forget, he is the host of the famous now 9/11 Freefall Radio Show. Welcome, Andy.
Hi, yeah, don't forget that one. We have G. Edward Griffin this week, by the way. That's a big one. Yeah. So thank you, Richard. Just to let everyone know, I'm here to help with any technical glitches, which will happen from time to time. We also will be taking your calls at the end of, not your calls, rather your questions at the end of the webinar today. You can submit them in the questions and information form online at ae911truth.org. Just go up to continuing education and select the live webinars. There's a box right there. I'll definitely see it. I'll also be glancing at the Facebook and YouTube comments under this broadcast to see if there's any good questions or comments related to the material that Richard is presenting. So with all that said, back to you, Richard.
And thank you, Andy. Let's go to that view and this one and let you know something about myself anyway. I was responsible for the construction documents for these $3 and $10 million gymnasiums. And more recently, before launching full-time into this 9/11 outreach effort, I had similar responsibilities working on this $400 million mixed-use project with nearly 1,200 tons of fireproof steel framing. This is near Las Vegas, 6 blocks of retail, mid-rise office space, parking structure. Now, though, I'm focused on what really happened at the World Trade Center using the material in these courses. So with that in mind, let's get right into it. The design of these towers, just a note on that. Some hailed it as the crowning achievement of the international style. Others, heartless modernism, right? You just extrude 2 squares until they become the tallest buildings in the world, which outpaced the Empire State Building, which was the tallest building in the world at the time in the mid-70s when these towers were topped off. 1,368 feet tall and 12-foot floor-to-floor height. Structural innovations and circulation throughout the building. Those innovations were paramount in this building. For instance, there's 100 elevator cabs in each of these towers, getting people in 3 stages to their respective locations. A huge number of occupants, 50,000 plus, almost 3 times that in visitors every day. Insurmountable, almost, achievement to overcome. And they did a great job here. Did an even better job with the structural system, because up to that time we had this, which is a forest of columns throughout the tenant spaces, severely impacting the ability of tenants to locate their offices. But with the Twin Towers, what they did was move the half the columns outside in an exoskeleton, as you see here. And then, in fact, these are 3 vertical, 3 horizontal, which are structural members, which are welded in the factory and then brought out and erected, as you see. In the center, 47 massive core columns. At the bottom, 52 inches by 22 inches solid steel. Mid-height, 16 inches by 30 inches by 16 inches, I think it is. And between these 2 structures was the floor system with lightweight steel trusses, over which was poured 4-inch thick and 8-inch thick concrete floors. So this allowed an incredible opportunity to have 60 feet on the two sides and 35 feet on the other sides, open office planning it was available for. We had an acre in size in these buildings. These are mammoth buildings. And so that allowed what you see here for the first time in history in our skyscrapers, huge spans, allowing freedom of the tenants to lay out their spaces as they would like. There were problems associated, though, with these buildings. One was they had a relatively lower ceiling height, 9 feet, and for such a large, long space, that seemed oppressive. And the columns were marching every 3 feet 4 inches all the way around the outside, so you don't get these uninhibited cityscape views like you had with the in the 80s and in the 90s, particularly as structural innovations continued, and you had complete picture windows of the cityscape below. So also we have by the time of 2001 and 9/11, we had severe requirements for the upgrading, for instance, of asbestos, not upgrading, but the renovation of the buildings, requiring the removal thereof, these mitigation measures, and requiring $5 to $10 billion by different estimates. And then upgrades required for the mechanical, electrical, and communication systems to make them competitive with modern skyscrapers. So these buildings were not, by many researchers' estimates, less than half occupied by the time of 9/11. They were white elephants. And the owner of Building 7, which we looked at in the first part of this 3-part series, World Trade Center 7, the third tower to collapse, that was built by Larry Silverstein, who, in a deal that consummated just 6 weeks prior to 9/11, he acquired these twin towers. So for $125 million of his partner's money, and that was leveraged to $3.2 billion, he purchased the rest of the twin towers and the other World Trade Center buildings. So that's a little background, which is, of course, very interesting and raises a few eyebrows. Nevertheless, let's move forward and look at what happened that day and how this official myth was developed.
On September 11th, we learned that 4 passenger planes were hijacked and taken radically off course. Within an hour, 2 of the planes had flown into the enormous steel towers of the World Trade Center, creating fires and eventually toppling them. Dazed by the news, the American public soon believed the fires in the towers had burned so hot they caused the steel frames of the buildings to give way. A myth developed, fed by official sources through the media to a bewildered audience.
So what was attacked again?
Elements of the myth. The impact of the airplanes, gallons of burning jet fuel, steel melting, the buildings failing and suddenly imploding. In a mere 10 seconds, 110 stories hurtled earthward, pulverizing into dust. Right from the start, on the street itself, the official story was born.
Come out of nowhere and just scream right into the side of the Twin Tower, exploding through the other side. And then I witnessed both towers collapse, one first and then the second, mostly due to structural failure because the fire was just too intense.
The myth bled into the FEMA report and was echoed by the experts.
It was the combination of the impact load doing great damage to the building, followed by the fire, that caused collapse.
Well, here's the official story in a nutshell. Took them years to develop that, but to decide on it. But where did they get it first? From the bozo on the street with the Fox News hat, who mostly due to structural failure because the fire was just too intense. Where do they find people like this? Nobody talks like that. Eyewitness. Who says that? But it did in turn come out to be the official story, even though the story that day was dominantly about explosives and explosions in the World Trade Center as the cause of the collapse of those buildings, and not the explosions of the towers either. This is a report authored by Graham McQueen and Ted Walter. And this great gumshoe research yielded that 36 out of 40 reports that morning discussed explosions, and many of them source reporting through the FBI, the FDNY, and the New York Police Department. Many of them were witnesses themselves of explosions, and we'll listen to a few of those. But let's see what happened. The North Tower was hit at 8:46 in the morning. It collapses about an hour and a half later. So many people associate the destruction of the buildings with the impacts of the aircraft and those massive explosions. But no, even NIST acknowledges that most of that jet fuel burned up outside the building. You can see that, in fact. And then the rest of it, they say, is gone in just 10 minutes. So all that did was to start fires which we'll be looking at in a moment. In the South Tower, it was hit at 9:03 by Flight 175 United. It collapses about an hour later. So, and it's hit about 30 stories down versus 15 stories down in the North Tower. 15 stories, 30 stories. So that's an overview. There were investigations, of course, into this, starting with volunteers, which were handpicked and which worked themselves into the subsequent investigations called the FEMA report, which came out in 2002. We'll be looking at that. We looked at that with regard to Building 7 quite a bit already. And they had limited funding, $600,000. Their efforts were hampered. According to the New York Times, they couldn't get access to the blueprints of the building, look at the steel. It was more like a guided tour, they said. And NIST then took over the investigation in 2005 with authorization from Congress, as we'll see what their task was versus what they produced. They had $20 million, though, to produce it, which is good. Now, NIST is part of the executive branch of the government, the Department of Commerce. The entire leadership was changed out under the Department of Commerce and in NIST when the Bush administration came to power. We have the theory that NIST put forth, which is the column failure theory. Essentially, the fires, which they say were raging, caused these floors to sag, and when they sagged, they pulled these columns in, apparently all around the building at once, because they came down almost uniformly. But the problem is that sagging floor trusses do not have the force necessary to pull in these columns. So NIST, in their computer model, invented a force, 5,000 pounds of force, and that in their computer model did indeed force the building to fail. So this is called fraud, and this is one of the reasons we look very carefully throughout NIST's body of false claims here, and one of which was the size and scope of the fires themselves at the time of the collapse. As you can see, the fires are few, and diminished at the time of the collapse, indicated by the thick black smoke, and that they're oxygen starved and thus cooler fires. And we'll look more at that next week, the temperatures of these fires. Hold on one second. Graphic paint. Just remembered one other important body of evidence we'll add to next week's part 3 in this 3-part series. So we use the scientific method at AE 911 Truth. We've had it in the West for 100 years or so. It's how we winnow error from truth, fact from fiction, fantasy from reality. We come up with a question. How did the towers collapse? We do some background research. How have other towers collapsed? We make observations. We construct a hypothesis or a series of hypotheses. Maybe jet planes were responsible. Maybe it was the ensuing fire, or both. That's the official story. Or maybe it was explosions, as we'll see plenty of evidence for today. And maybe it was controlled demolition, as we will see overwhelming and irrefutable evidence today and next week. So whatever those hypotheses are, we approach them without subjectivity, without our inherent biases, such as political or financial objectives that might sway the opinion in the matter. We want an objective opinion. So we make predictions based on those hypotheses. We test them with experiments. We analyze the results. We draw conclusions. If the hypothesis is corroborated, we report the results in an open, transparent manner, so all can build on the body of the work that we're about. Now, we don't hide the computer input data as NIST has done, as we discussed last week in part 1 of this series, and keep that from the architects and engineers who are tasked with ensuring the public safety, claiming, as NIST did, that it would jeopardize public safety if we were to release this computer input data that we requested under the Freedom of Information Act. Now, in this case, the hypothesis is not corroborated. That's the conclusion that I believe that you will be arriving at near the end of this presentation. And if that's so, what do? We go back and construct a new hypothesis until we have one that is supported by the evidence. So let's proceed with a look at the forces that destroy buildings. Fire is certainly one of them, though it's never destroyed a steel frame high-rise. In fact, there is no precedent for such a thing in a fireproofed building. But fire is an organic and chaotic process. It moves through a building randomly, almost looking for fresh new fuel sources after destroying an area. It can only last in an area about 20 or 30 minutes. And even NIST acknowledges this, though they contradict themselves throughout the World Trade Center reports that they produced. They do acknowledge that the fires don't last more than 20 or 30 minutes in a modern office building. But what about wood frame buildings, where the structure itself is flammable? We try to protect those buildings, but they do collapse quite often, especially homes. When they do, they fall over to the path of least resistance, not straight down through the tons of cold, hard, intact structure that may be below a taller wood frame building, for instance. But what about a steel frame building? Well, we had the largest test of its kind in the UK in 1995. They built an 8-story building out of steel framing, and much of it was not even fireproofed because they really wanted a worst case situation. They tried to build 2,000-degree fires in there with incredible quantities of kindling, as you can see, the worst case scenario here. And what did they find? They found that the steel did not fail. It warped, it sagged. That was expected, particularly in the non-fireproofed beams, as you see here. The connections do not fail. Now, this is extremely important, as we saw, because NIST claimed that the connections failed in the case of Building 7 last week. And they conclude that this is an inherently stable behavior due to the highly redundant nature of the structural steel form. So that's extraordinary. Let's look at structures, though, that have been on fire and see what has actually happened.
May 4th, 1988, the First Interstate Bank, a 62-story building in Los Angeles, California, suffered a 3.5-hour fire which burned across 5 floors and caused an estimated $200 million of damage. It did not collapse. February 23rd, 1991, the One Meridian Plaza, a 38-story building in Philadelphia, suffered an 18-hour fire which burned across 8 floors. The fire caused an estimated $100 million worth of damage and 3 firefighters died fighting it. It was later described by officials as the most significant fire of the century. It did not collapse. October 17th, 2004, the East Tower of the Park Central complex in Caracas, Venezuela, suffered a 17-hour fire which spread across 26 of its 56 floors. It did not collapse. August 18th, 2007, a fire broke out on the 17th floor of the Deutsche Bank building in New York, a building undergoing deconstruction after being heavily damaged by debris from the South Tower on 9/11. Originally 41 stories in height, it had been reduced to 26 at the time of the fire, which lasted 7 hours and affected a total of 10 floors. 2 firefighters died of smoke inhalation. It did not collapse. On 9/11 itself, 5 World Trade Center, a 9-story building east of the North Tower, was engulfed in flames after sustaining heavy damage from falling debris. A number of partial collapses occurred, but the overall structure remained standing. February 9th, 2009, the Mandarin Oriental Hotel in Beijing was completely engulfed in flames for more than 3 hours during the Lunar New Year celebrations. The fire affected all 44 floors, igniting fireworks as it burned. 1 firefighter died fighting it. It did not collapse.
And nor did these post 9/11 fully engulfed fires cause the collapses of these buildings. No, steel frame fireproof buildings just don't collapse. And yet we're told that these fires, relatively small, diminished at the time of the collapse, and cooler, caused the collapse of the Twin Towers. So you can begin to see why 3,400 architects and engineers, at least, plus millions of others around the world, are questioning the collapse of this building. And you'll see a lot more reason to question as we go forward. Now, these buildings fell due to natural causes, in this case, earthquakes. The buildings fall over to the path of least resistance. The building is certainly damaged, but it's not shredded. The structure is not severed, the columns and beams one from another. The concrete is not pulverized to a fine powder. This is in distinct contrast to the World Trade Center evidence that we'll be looking at today. These buildings exploded. There's thick, billowing, enormous, pyroclastic-like clouds expanding rapidly in cauliflower-shaped forms due to the incredible heat released in the chemical ignitions of these explosions. We have witnesses that hear sounds of explosions. They see flashes of light. If you have these features, you know you have explosions. Now, explosions, absent the impact of the aircraft, are not a part of the official story for the destruction of these buildings. Explosions can be harnessed quite effectively, as you see here in this series of controlled demolitions. There's only a handful of companies in the United States that can accomplish this. They place thousands of shaped cutter charges throughout the columns and beams in the building and then detonate them in a very precise order. And that's what you get, is a building that falls with a set of features. And let's look at those features. Beginning with, there's a sudden onset of destruction, usually at the base of the structure, but that's not always the case. There's a straight down symmetrical collapse, usually, but not always. And there's a because there's a pattern removal of column supports. That's how you achieve that. They can bring buildings down asymmetrically if they want as well, as you just saw. The building falls at near free fall acceleration, straight down through what was the path of greatest resistance, the thousands of tons of structure beneath. We have, therefore, then the total dismemberment of that structural steel frame, looking like a house of cards in typical controlled demolitions. Something else happens with the World Trade Center towers, which we'll be showing you in a moment. There's limited damage to adjacent structures. That's one of the goals of controlled demolition. Feature 7, there's explosions heard by witnesses, flashes of light seen by witnesses. The concrete floors are broken up because you don't want to have to go back and jackhammer those floors. Let the explosives do that work so you can break it up for loading and shipment. So there's explosive charges visible at many of the floors. These are called squibs in the explosive demolition industry. They're obviously explosions, puffs of smoke that occur here and there. We'll be looking at quite a bit of these features in a moment. There's chemical evidence left behind of the explosive devices, and we'll be looking at that in next week. But all this is direct evidence of destruction with explosives. A fire does not create these features, any of them, let alone all of them. The fire causes structures to collapse asymmetrically, with gradual deformation, following the path of least resistance. So experts just were quite puzzled about the collapse of this building. How could it have even happened? And why has no other building ever been destroyed by fire? Well, there's a lot of good reasons. One reason is steel conducts the heat away from its source because it's just so dense. So the steel never really gets to its 1200, or rarely gets to its 1200 degree Fahrenheit temperature, at which it can lose half of its strength and begin to sag. Also, to keep that from happening, we put cementitious fireproofing on these steel beams. 2 hours of fire protection on the beams and 3 hours on the columns. Now, that's 4 to 6 times as much as is required, because remember, even as NIST acknowledges, the fire is only in a given area for 20 or 30 minutes. So if this fire protection is quite adequate, and we require the buildings to be built out of a non-combustible materials, the structure, and then the content that these tenants can bring in is for large measure non-combustible and flame retardant. But just to keep the fire from ever becoming a problem, we put sprinklers in our high-rise buildings just as an extra safety measure. And in the case of the towers, we're told that the sprinklers were inoperative due to the impact of the airplanes. And we don't need to argue that point, though it is arguable. We're looking at the features of controlled demolition. With government documentation, that can be very helpful. Foreknowledge of the destruction of a building. Experts agreeing, yeah, that building was destroyed by controlled demolition. At least those experts who have, without financial or political obligations that might sway their objective opinion in the matter of whether a building is a controlled demolition. With video documentation, all this can be proof of controlled demolition, a body of proof that we're going to apply to the World Trade Center Twin Towers, beginning with, is there a sudden onset of destruction? And where is it? At the base of the building, as is typical? No, not in the case of the Twin Towers. At the point of jet plane impacts. Let's take a look. Notice that there's no jolt or hesitation. It's standing there, and then all of a sudden, it's in uniform motion, down. No hesitation as structure is impacting down below. Same with the South Tower. It's standing still, and then all of a sudden, sudden, smooth motion. Is there patterned explosions and flashes of light heard and seen by witnesses? Yeah. Let's go to the oral histories commissioned by Thomas von Essen, the fire commissioner, to preserve those accounts before they became reshaped by a collective memory. So the city would not release this information of 503 orally recorded first responders until they were sued by the New York Times. And the court ordered the release of this information in 2005, which we did not have available to us until then. So what do we find? They published this on their website, actually, and we find that through the exhaustive research of Graham McQueen, from a professor from Toronto, 118 of them are observing flashes of light, sounds of explosions, and other phenomena, such as like this. We felt the ground shake. You could see the towers sway, and then it just came down. Now, again and again, with these witnesses, you're going to see a very specific order of events. The phenomena of explosions, and then afterward, the tower coming down. Not the tower producing these noises and these visual evidence of explosions. For instance, all of a sudden, the ground just started shaking. It felt like a train running under my feet. The next thing we know, we look up, and the tower is collapsing. It shook my bones. Shortly before the first tower came down, I remember feeling the ground shaking. I heard a terrible noise, and then debris just started flying everywhere. An explosion appeared at the very top, simultaneously from all four sides. Materials shot out horizontally, and then there seemed to be a momentary delay before you could see the beginning of the collapse. I saw a flash at the lower level of the building. You know, like when they demolish a building. There was an explosion in the South Tower, one floor under another. When it hit about the fifth floor, I figured it was a bomb because it looked like a synchronized, deliberate kind of thing. I saw a flash at the lower level of the building. You know, like when they demolish a building. Wait a minute. Did I just say that one? Like on television, when they blow up these buildings, seemed like it was going all the way around like a belt. All these explosions. Let's take a look at what they're talking about. Here's the North Tower on the right, a known controlled demolition on the left. Just visually, is there a similarity? Is there enough similarity to warrant an investigation into the possible use of explosives, especially since it looks exactly like a controlled demolition, especially since fire, the official narrative of how this building came down, has never brought down a skyscraper, ever. Should it not have been the first hypothesis that NIST came up with and seriously considered, rather than being relegated to a series of very frequently asked questions published years later on their website? What do they say? Well, the question itself, why didn't NIST consider controlled demolition hypothesis? We do not support controlled demolition. The collapse was initiated at the impact and fire floors and nowhere else, suggesting that if it were controlled demolition, it would have had to start at the base of the building like most controlled demolitions do, but as you'll see, not all. Video evidence also showed, they say unambiguously, that the collapse progressed from the top to the bottom. Any blast explosions in the region below the impact, there's no evidence of blast. They say NIST found no corroborating evidence for alternative hypotheses suggesting that the World Trade Center towers were brought down by controlled demolition. You're going to see a lot of evidence today and a whole lot more next week in this three-part series. This is part 2 and 3 of 9/11, an architect's guide. You ever see professional demolition where they set charges on certain floors and you hear the pop, pop, pop? That's when I heard that friggin' noise. That's when I saw the building coming down. Somewhere around the middle of the World Trade Center, there was this orange and red flash coming out. Initially, just one flash. Then this flash just kept popping all the way around the building, and the building had started to explode. Saw a number of brief light sources being emitted from inside the building between floors 10 and 15. You saw about 6 of these brief flashes, accompanied by a crackling sound, before the tower collapsed. I saw low-level flashes. I saw flash, 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 and then it looked like the building came down. The building was blowing out on all 4 sides. We actually heard the pops. You heard the pops of the building. With each popping sound, initially an orange, and then a red flash came out of the building and just go all the way around the building on both sides. Let's look at the South Tower, see if there's any similarity. It's on the right to a known controlled demolition on the left. Enough similarity to warrant an investigation into the possible use of explosives, especially since it looks exactly like a controlled demolition. And again, especially since fires never caused the collapse of a steel frame building. I thought the terrorists planted explosives somewhere in the building. That's how loud it was, a crackling explosive. Another loud boom at the upper floors, and then there was a series of smaller explosions that appeared to go completely around the building at the upper floors. And another loud earth-shattering blast and a large fireball which blew out more debris. The lower level of the building, like when they demolish a building, that's what I thought I saw. Do you see any flashes? I said, yes. Well, I thought it was just me. He said, no, I saw them too. Everybody, I think, at that point still thought these things were blown up. So I was fully expecting anything else to blow up. You were there when the planes hit? I said, no, I was there when the building exploded. You mean when it fell down? No, when it exploded. Let's listen to these witnesses.
As we were getting our gear on and making our way to the stairway, there was a heavy-duty explosion.
The whole building just collapsed on us inside the lobby.
Was that a secondary explosion?
Yes, it was.
That was the
planet problem?
Yeah, definitely secondary explosion.
I heard a second explosion and another rumble.
An hour later than that, we had that big explosion from much, much lower.
It just went ba-boom, it was like a bomb went off. And another explosion came right from it, just everyone flying.
There were numerous secondary explosions taking place in that building. There were continuous explosions.
No, the first explosion, and there was a second explosion in the same building. There were 2 explosions.
Okay.
Federal agencies that were down there do believe that there was some sort of explosive device somewhere else besides the planes hitting.
There was another explosion that took place in one of the towers here. So obviously, according to his theory, he thinks that there were actually devices that were planted in the building.
There was a secondary explosion, probably a device either planted before or on the aircraft that did not explode until an hour later.
Then there was no secondary explosions and then the subsequent collapses.
That the FBI most likely thinks that there was a car or truck packed with explosives underneath the buildings, which also exploded at the same time and brought both of them down.
Now, that's the first time we're hearing that. So 2 planes and explosives that were in the building. Is that correct?
That is the working theory at this point. That is
A huge explosion now waiting to bring on all of us.
It sounded like gunfire. Bang, 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 bang. And then all of a sudden, 3 big explosions.
About 50 consecutive bangs, and it fell down like a waterfall.
And we heard the noise associated with an implosion. We heard a very loud blast, an explosion. We looked up, and the building literally began to collapse before us.
We heard a loud explosion, and at that point, Building 2 was collapsing.
At that point, we heard a large boom. I looked up and just saw the building coming at us.
Do you know if it was an explosion or if it was a building collapse?
To me, it sounded like an explosion.
There was another major explosion. The building itself, literally the top of it came down.
All of a sudden you hear explosion and you could see the building starting to collapse.
Huge explosion that we all heard and felt.
We understand now there has been a secondary explosion on Tower 2.
According to the Associated Press, another building that has either been attacked or exploded.
The tower, rather, that has collapsed, though we are told, collapsed because of a third explosion.
And about an hour later after that, there was a huge explosion at the base of the South Tower. That's the One World Trade Center, and part of the building collapsed.
We could hear a rumble, which was about 5 seconds long, preceding the actual collapse, and then a boom when each of those towers collapsed.
Just seconds ago, there was a huge explosion, and it appears right now the Second World Trade Tower has just collapsed.
I was about 5 blocks away when I heard explosions.
And then you heard from far away, boom, boom. And you heard the boom, 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 boom.
Floor by floor, it started popping out. It was if they had detonated. If they were planned to take down a building. Boom, 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 boom.
From the corner, boom, 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 boom. Just like 20 straight hits. And as the bombs were going, people just started running. And I sat there and watched a few of them explode. And it just started going pop. It just started going boom, 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 boom. And he goes, how fast? I go, like firecrackers.
How many of these witnesses of explosions do you imagine were included in the NIST report? 0. And yet they claim to have interviewed 1,000 witnesses. They missed all of these. NIST says, well, it couldn't have been a controlled demolition because it didn't start at the top. Well, let's listen to Mark Loiseau, who says you can start anywhere. And we'll look at a top-down controlled demolition too.
You can go almost anywhere in the structure, and given the right circumstances, you can release all of that stored energy, converting it into what is called kinetic energy. That's energy in motion, and that's what brings the building down.
And there's your top-down controlled demolition. NIST says, well, the top part drove the rest of the building down to the ground and then destroyed itself. That's essentially their collapse hypothesis. There's a problem with this, though. It violates Newton's third law of motion. There's an equal and opposite destructive force when two bodies collide, such as a Mack truck and a Volkswagen. The Volkswagen's going to be smashed before even the smallest part of the front part of the Mack truck is, right? It doesn't matter if we drop the Volkswagen on the Mack truck. No, the lightest part of a structure cannot possibly destroy the heavier, cold, hard, intact steel, which is getting heavier and heavier and heavier as we go down each story. In fact, here's the top part, a plan of a column with 3/8 inch or so thickness, and then it gets heavier and heavier until we get down halfway here, where it's 30 inches by 16 inches or so. And then we have getting heavier and heavier until it's almost solid steel at the bottom. This is a virtual pyramid of structure here. Now, where did this theory come from? It came from Zdeněk Bazant of Chicago Northwestern University. This crush down, crush up theory, published in the Journal of Engineering Mechanics. This paper was submitted just 2 days after 9/11. The rest of us were in shock trying to figure out who was attacking us, what's really going on here. And this gentleman has been cranking away on an extremely advanced paper that has a whole bunch of problems, the least of which is that it is completely obfuscates what's really going on with it. Now, so highly suspect, and as it's been decoded now by other structural engineers, they found that the formulas are actually correct, but the input data is falsified. What do we mean by this? Well, first of all, it's obfuscated. It's extremely difficult to decode. Plus, they fraudulently removed an entire story of columns at the point of jet plane impacts in order to get the building to fall freely to create a dynamic load on the floor below, falling freely for 12 feet. Just eliminate all the columns. Completely unrealistic. They doubled the mass up above. They decreased the column strength below by 3, and they decreased the velocity loss due to the law of conservation of momentum, as well as the column reserve strength. So at a minimum, this the use of these fraudulent input data rigged the equation 12-1 in favor of a collapse. And it was never questioned, or at least that we know of, by others until this was submitted. And I'll show you what happened then. But first, we have the submitted by other engineers associated with AE 9/11 Truth. What some of them found is that the downward momentum would have been arrested after just 2 seconds in any kind of a natural collapse. As we'd expect, the Volkswagen would run into the front of the Mack truck and stop. So we have these errors that have been refuted by engineers, specifically Tony Zamboti and Richard Johns in 2014, and then also in 2013, including Gregory Zudolinski. Now, these errors of Bezant were upheld by the American Society of Civil Engineers. They won't publish it. Why? They say that it's out of scope. Well, wait a minute. It's not out of scope to show the errors in a previously published paper. This is what happens all the time with peer-reviewed papers. That's the purpose of peer-reviewed papers, to establish a truth based on a body of interacting scientific reports. The truth rises to the top, but not in this case, because the American Society of Civil Engineers denied the opportunity to have this paper challenged. Now, there's a case filed about this, and we expect imminent results from that, an ethics case. So let's look at the North Tower and actually see what happens to the Volkswagen up here. It's crushing itself. The top of this building is being destroyed. Let me show it to you this way. Look at the bottom red line. It's not going down. It doesn't go down for 4 seconds. So the question is, what's crushing the Volkswagen up here? The structure of this upper section. Because it's not the structure below, because it hasn't even met the structure below yet. It's being destroyed in the first 4 seconds. Take a look here as we start and stop, just like the firefighters described, like a band of explosions wrapping all the way around the building. Start and stop. And so NIST says in their column failure theory that these exterior columns were bowed in by the sagging floor trusses. Is that true? We do know that the columns were bowing in. We can see that very clearly. The question is, what's causing that? Is it sagging floor trusses? Or is it something else alluded to by FEMA before NIST took over their investigation in 2002?
When the collapse finally starts, the antenna started just a little bit before the exterior of the building started. And that tells us that the core columns let go first.
Now, this is extremely important. They're telling us the antenna drops, and you can see it dropping compared up to, down to, antenna up to, antenna down to, compared to that upper border of this video frame. Again, up to, down to, back to, forward to. So that's about 10 or 20 feet right there. This is a 400-foot tall antenna. And Why is that important? Well, what does the antenna sit on? It sits on this hat truss. Well, what does the hat truss sit on? It sits on these core columns. So they had to have given first in order for the antenna to fall first. That's really important, because if they fall first, then the hat truss falls, then the core columns would pull on the perimeter columns because they're attached by the lightweight steel trusses. So the core columns go down, they pull on the lightweight steel trusses, and that's what pulls on these perimeter columns in this crude animation by some film company. They don't actually show the bowing in this case, but that's what actually happened, as we saw in the video. So, by the way, none of the videos or photos show a section of building driving down the rest of the building. None of them. It's just missing. The building's being destroyed, as we'll take another close look at. Had it been there, it would have destroyed these few remaining columns, which survived for a few seconds the initial destruction of this building. That section would have crushed all the columns. That spire could not have survived. And then there's an explosion down below, and it goes straight down, frame by frame, as you see, as the dust is shaken off of it. So is it a collapse or is it an explosion? A building, the North Tower on the left, the volcanic eruption in the Tongan Sea on the right. Upward, outward, arching streamers, a geometry of fireworks, freely flying solid objects trailed by thick white smoke clouds, which we'll get to those thick white smoke clouds next week when we look at extreme heat generated in the North Tower. Does it look anything like a gravitational collapse? Now you can begin to understand why 36 reporters brought us the Twin Towers explosive demolition on 9/11, the narrative that was operative on the first day. And then the national media takes over the narrative on the second day with these statements from officials and hand-picked structural engineers who tell us that the building fell, it collapsed due to the massive fires and the impacts of the airplane on the columns. When all of us were looking at a series of explosions, including the firefighters that we talked about, we're then being gaslighted by officials that something else altogether happened, and the media as well, the national media. So do we have a straight down symmetrical progression, not inside the footprint like we saw with Building 7, but something very destructive is going on here and unique in the Twin Towers, unique in terms of controlled demolition? Let's look at the South Tower. It begins to fall over. So we have asymmetrical loading from this section that's falling over at 22 degrees. We have asymmetrical damage from the airplanes. We have asymmetrical damage from the fires up above. Then how in the world do we have complete symmetrical destruction down the face like the firefighters described all around the building? It's a complete non sequitur. It makes no sense. It's physically impossible. So what are we looking at? Well, let's zoom in. Here's a lower section of this corner of the building, the North Tower. What are you looking at? Can you describe it? How would you describe this? I see a series of explosions, dozens of them, right before our very eyes, that can be characterized by no less than explosions, dozens of them. Every floor. You can see that same corner here, racing down. Almost as fast as the freely falling debris next to it. We'll come to the speed of this acceleration. Notice also the squibs, which we'll come to later. What are we looking at? The damage is done in a 12 to 1400 foot diameter outside each of these towers. It is symmetrical. So the destruction down the face of the building is fairly symmetrical. The damage is also very symmetrical in its debris field, destroying the Winter Gardens 600 feet away from the North Tower, as you see here. These freely flying structural steel sections are all over the World Trade Center site. It's a very explosive event. Compare that to the nice, neat implosion of World Trade Center Building 7, which we looked at in part 1 of this 3-part series last week, versus the very explosive event known as the destruction of the Twin Towers. Do we have ejections of building materials? Well, look at the squibs. Again, a term used in the controlled demolition industry, here and here and here. We're told, oh, these are puffs of air by NIST, produced by that section of building driving the rest of the building down like a piston. That air's got to go somewhere, right? Going down the elevator hoistways. Well, let's say that that's true. And it would come down the elevator hoistways, and maybe an elevator door was open on these floors. And that pressure would fill that open office planning that we saw earlier, full of pressure uniformly, and blow out all those windows or none of them, but not these highly focalized, pinpoint accurate, violent ejections that we see here, 20 and 40 and 60 stories down below the point of jet plane impacts, or in this case, above the point of jet plane impacts in the South Tower. In this looped video, just as it begins to fall down, the structure is being destroyed from the inside, even before it causes a collapse, where you'd expect it to crush some floors below and maybe fall off. But no, it's being destroyed from inside. These squibs are looked at in the South Tower by physics teacher David Chandler.
Here I'm measuring the ejection velocity of a squib on the east face of the South Tower. At this angle, there is foreshortening, but the calibration distance is foreshortened by the same proportion. Plotting horizontal position versus time, the slope indicates the ejection velocity, which is 67 meters per second, or 150 miles per hour.
150 miles per hour. This is 160 to 200 feet per second. These are explosive speeds, not air pressure speeds. How fast is the building coming down? Let's go back to David Chandler, physics teacher, in a moment. But first, let's compare the animation on the right with the actual collapse on the left, where we have 7 seconds, 10 seconds. In about 12 seconds, the building, sorry about that video. Maybe we can get a better one if we try again. Let's see. Back and forward. There we go. That's a little better. 3 seconds. 7 seconds. In a dozen seconds, both of the towers are completely destroyed. How fast is that? Okay, now David Chandler.
We are here tracking the motion of the roofline at 0.2 second intervals through approximately 32 meters or 8 stories. This graph shows the height of the roofline as a function of time. The analysis is simpler if we plot velocity as a function of time. On this kind of a graph, a straight line indicates constant acceleration. First note that there is a sudden onset of collapse, as the point we are tracking makes a sudden transition from being at rest to an approximately constant downward acceleration. The slope of the graph indicates that the acceleration is 6.31 meters per second squared downward, which is 64% of free fall.
64% of free fall. It's in almost near, it's near free fall. It's almost free fall. It's not decelerating. It's not slowing down. But don't we think this amount of structure would have slowed down the building just a little bit, if not completely, right? Because after all, this is steel columns, 80,000 tons of steel beneath the point of jet plane impacts. And steel, even when it's buckling, gives a minimum resistance. In this case, 25%. As the steel buckles, it never goes to zero. It always has some capability to resist that load. So we shouldn't see any acceleration. We should only see deceleration. Look at it another way. We have a huge section of the Twin Towers held up by a magic crane, the upper above the point of jet plane impacts, over nothing but air. On the left, the same section of building, but we put that over the top of 80,000 tons of structural steel, 3 times stronger than it needs to be to support that load. And we'll even give it that fraudulent 12 feet of free drop that Zdenek Bazant gave it, so it can develop a dynamic impact. What do we think is going to happen when we release the lever and drop both these at the same time? Well, this is 7th grade physics, right? We're talking about, it's very intuitive. The one on the right is going to fall at free fall. That's basically the definition of free fall. No resistance. It's going to hit the ground in about 9 seconds. The one on the left, NIST says it's essentially falling at free fall. They acknowledge that. So it's a real problem. Here's another way to look at it.
Something of this kind is what we should have seen when the top section of the towers collapsed onto the lower one. The upper and lower sections should have mutually destroyed each other until all the energy is dissipated and the system comes to a rest. Alternatively, as shown in this experiment with 2 towers made of snow, the top section could have fallen off to the side after the initial collapse. What could not have happened is this.
Little tiny chunk of the building can't possibly fall and crush the entire structure below it.
This is such a simple, fundamental concept that architects and engineers were astonished in seeing it totally ignored by NIST.
This is high school physics, and our whole society is being led to believe that these fundamental laws of physics, hard science, don't apply anymore.
But they do, of course, and that's why we did at least get one of these papers submitted and published in the Journal of Protective Structures outside the American Society of Civil Engineers, which had a direct stake in the official narrative of how these buildings came down, because they provided the volunteers, which concluded that in the initial report that they did, that the buildings came down by jet plane impacts and the fires. So we move on. Is there the total shattering of the structural steel system? What can cause that? Well, the National Fire Protection Guide 921 for fire and explosion investigation, the guide used around the world, certainly in America and quite a bit around the world, for the investigation of these things. And they say, look for effects of explosions, like shrapnel effects, like high-order damage, characterized by the shattering of the structure, producing small pulverized debris, with the building completely demolished, debris thrown great distances. And that's exactly what we have, a complete dismemberment of the structural steel system, save these remaining shards around the building. It's completely shattered, broken down to its original 37.5-foot lengths in large measure. And what else do we have? The feature number 7, lateral ejection of structural steel. Let's look at this, because the NFPA 921 also says look for blast pressure wave effects. Heavy structural steel pieces freely flying. This means explosions. Do we have this? Yes, we have 2 and 4 ton structural steel sections impaled in all the buildings around it. And we have them freely flying, as you can see in these very well documented video segments of these. This is not like a banana peeling. These are freely flying. You can see them most clearly, like right there. Wait, that's 45 degrees. It starts out horizontal. What force shot out an 8-ton structural steel section laterally? And then gravity begins to take over, and the angle shifts to about 45 degrees here. Well, and why is it trailing thick white smoke clouds? Steel isn't flammable under office fire conditions. What else is going on here? It's not flammable, as you'll see next week, under jet fuel conditions either, by the way. So let's look at the physics of this from David Chandler, physics teacher again.
Girders weighing several tons were found 600 feet from the base of the North Tower. How fast they were ejected depends on where they originated. If they came from high in the building, they were thrown outward at about 50 miles per hour. If they came from lower down, the speed had to be even greater. Gravity alone cannot account for such high lateral ejection speeds.
I'm here measuring the horizontal speed of what appears to be 1 or more wall units, which are being thrown northward from the North Tower. Because it was recorded by a handheld camera, I had to first stabilize the image. Then I did the measurements from the stabilized version of the video. Final result, 35 meters per second, which is 78 miles per hour.
78 miles per hour. This is enough energy to hurl a 200-pound cannonball 3 miles. And there were thousands of these. Where is all this energy coming from? And by the way, if 100,000 tons of steel framing is distributed outside the tower's footprint, and I mean up to 600 feet outside, what's crushing the building? This is 1/3 of the weight of the building. You think the concrete floors were crushing the building. Okay, we'll come back and look at that in a moment. In fact, let's look at it right now, because those floors are missing down at the bottom. When we have a pancaking collapse, we expect to see pancakes at the bottom. But the floors are not stacked up. We don't see 50. We don't see 20. We don't see 10. We don't even see 1 acre-sized floor. Where did they go? All we see is a 2-story pile of core columns and other miscellaneous metal. Where's the concrete? Oh, here it is. It's pulverized in midair before the building even develops its kinetic energy and reaches the ground. It's pulverized to a fine powder. Now, all the videos and photos show exactly that, spreading out again outside the footprint of the building in a 3 square mile area. 100 micron particles in size, 3 inches thick all around lower Manhattan. 30% of that dust is concrete, powdered concrete. Something pulverized the concrete. Let's listen to the governor of Pataki.
And you see, and there's no concrete. There's very little concrete. All you see is aluminum and steel. What happened to the concrete? The concrete was pulverized. And I was down here Tuesday, and it was like you were on a foreign planet. All of lower Manhattan, not just this site, from river to river, there was dust, powder, 2-3 inches thick. The concrete was just pulverized.
You have 2 110-story office buildings. You don't find a desk. You don't find a chair. You don't find a telephone, a computer. The biggest piece of a telephone I found was half of the keypad, and it was about this big. The building collapsed to dust.
What I expected to see was nothing like what I actually did see at the time of my arrival at the site. There wasn't much that you could say, you could describe. Everything was dust and metal. There was no typewriters, there was no chairs, there was no nothing.
Well, by the way, if 90,000 tons of concrete was pulverized and spread over 3 square miles, what's crushing the building? Wasn't the steel. That's outside the footprint, well outside the footprint. So we got 2/3 the weight of this building that's not even available to crush it. So much for Zdeněk Bazant's theory of crush down, crush up. Complete fraud. There was probably 10,000 steel file cabinets. This is the only one they could find. It's from an ice cream store in the basement. Almost everything was pulverized. Even the people.
In April 2006, New Yorkers were distressed to learn that bone fragments, human remains from 9/11, had been found on the roof of the nearby Deutsche Bank building.
And how, in God's name, did those fragments get there?
And bone fragments less than a centimeter long. How could they be so small?
Wait a minute. We have 700 bone fragments a half an inch long found on top of the Deutsche Bank building here. Well, they didn't come from the people in this airplane because those ejections were sent out this way. They didn't come from the people in this airplane because those ejections were blocked from hitting the Deutsche Bank building by the South Tower. So they're not from the people in the plane. Many of them were from the firefighters, actually, as indicated by the red triangular symbols. But the firefighters were, of course, not on the scene at the time of the plane impacts. They came later. So it wasn't from the people in the planes. We have 2,753 victims. 300 whole bodies were found. 21,900 pieces, in addition to that, were found. And 6,000 of those small enough to fit into a test tube. 200 pieces matched to one single person. And yet, more than 1,100 victims remain completely unaccounted for. Not a shred of evidence of them. This is a third of the people completely vaporized. Those that were found were up to 800 feet outside the Twin Towers. These small pieces distributed outside the towers. Could a gravitational collapse cause such pulverization and distribution? We'd expect those bodies to be found between floors, mangled in any kind of a gravitational collapse. This is direct evidence of destruction with explosives, is what we've been looking at. Fire doesn't create these features, any of them, let alone all of them, especially these fires, which were diminished at the time of the collapse. Indicated by the thick black smoke, they were oxygen-starved fires. We talked about the testimony of the first responders, but that's been expanded now from the 2015 additional research that Graham McQueen has done to 156 total eyewitnesses. And yet there's another very important eyewitness here. What's that? The Lamont Doherty Earth Observatory. Seismic waves generated by aircraft impacts and the building collapses. This facility is 20 miles north of Manhattan. And FEMA and NIST relied on this report from Columbia University, the experts who run it. So first, we have seismic signals near the time of the actual plane impacts. So where the narrative tells us that these are due to the plane impacts. Well, okay, that makes sense. Let's look at it though. And that was the in the North Tower. In the South Tower, a similar situation. We have seismic signals near the time of the second impact, 0.7 magnitude earthquake. So let's look at this very carefully, though. The signal occurs at 8:46 and 26 seconds. But the plane impact doesn't happen for 14 seconds after that. So how can the plane impact cause the signal? NIST says, well, we have an answer for that. We believe that the NTSB radar that the 9/11 Commission relied on, that's accurate to within a second, was not accurate that day. So we looked at the videos and we think it happened 10 seconds earlier. I'm not kidding you. They're still missing 4 seconds though, right? So what do? They go back to LDEO and get them to move their data back 3 seconds. I'm not making this up. They contracted privately in 2005. And there was a report generated that is not available to the public. We can't FOIA request it because it's a university. So how about the second plane impact at the South Tower? It occurs at 9:02 and 54 seconds. But the seismic event occurs at 9:02 and 54 seconds. But the plane, in this case, doesn't even occur for 17 seconds later. So what does NIST do? Once again, they use their own resources, ignoring the NTSB radar, which the 9/11 Commission relied on, which is accurate to within a second. But not that day, says NIST. 12 seconds. We think they were off by 12 seconds. And that we looked at the videos and we came up with 9:02 and 59 seconds. But they're still off by 5 seconds. So what do they do with that? Once again, they get NIST to move their data back. Get Columbia University to move their data back 3 seconds. And that puts them, I guess, within the realm of tolerance. And we don't get to view that report either. What could cause seismic events near the time of the plane impacts? Well, let's go to Mike Picaro, 36-year-old father. He's working in the World Trade Center basement. The whole building seemed to shake. There was a loud explosion. They arrived at the sea level. They found the machine shop gone. Nothing there but rubble, he says. We're talking about a 50-ton hydraulic press gone. They made their way to the parking garage and found it too was gone. The parking garage. Steel and concrete fire door weighed 300 pounds, wrinkled up like a piece of aluminum foil lying on the floor. A bomb had gone off in the building. So now we have witnesses of bombs in the basement, including William Rodriguez, a janitor, hailed as a hero by the Bush administration.
I was a janitor. Like I said, on that day, there was an explosion on the basement, and this is prior to the building got hit by the plane, and then the plane hit.
I think a bomb went off in the lobby first, then a plane hit the building.
The bomb hit the lobby first, and a couple of seconds in the first plane hit.
And so now we're talking about not only bombs in the basement, but bombs in the lobby before the plane hitting. In fact, this is corroborated by Andre Rousseau in 2012, applied geophysics expert, author of more than 50 published papers on progressive mechanical waves in geology, who says, hey, look, slow down, guys. The frequency of the Rayleigh waves are only 1 hertz. Well, what does that mean? The aircraft and crash impacts have much higher frequencies, above 10 hertz, often up to around 100 hertz. It's a 1 to 2 orders of magnitude different. And those frequencies were filtered out by the bandpass filters used. They couldn't even detect aircraft impacts. He says the range of the instruments doesn't allow for the recording of such waves. The seismic equipment is designed to detect seismic events like earthquakes and explosions around 1 hertz. Okay, the actual waves generated by the crash had to have been even deadened before hitting the ground. So they wouldn't even travel and make it to the Palisades 20 miles north, according to this expert. So let's look at the actual collapses now, because the first collapse, there's a seismic signal near the time of the first collapse. Creating a 2.1 magnitude event in the South Tower. In the North Tower, it then creates a 2.3 magnitude event. And we'll come back to the difference there in a moment. But we have the the waves hitting they're occurring at 10, 28, and 31 seconds. But the tower starts its descent before that, about 9 seconds before that. And the first debris strikes the pavement about a second after that. And the heaviest debris from this collapse doesn't even hit the ground until 4 more seconds. So 5 seconds later. So how is that discrepancy addressed by NIST? Well, NIST goes back to Columbia University and says, yet again, we want you to move your data back 3 seconds. That's going to help us out quite a bit. But they will not release the report that was produced in 2005 to justify it. So what could it be? Well, here's something that was failed, that Columbia University failed to address. The very well-defined primary and shear waves. They completely ignored them, Columbia University. These are occurring when? 4 seconds before the start of the tower's descent, the North Tower. Well, what could account for that? Let's go to the work of Professor Graham McQueen, who highlights another witness. The camera shakes both 6 and 10 seconds prior to the beginning of the collapse, corroborating the first responders' testimony, which you heard earlier. Here's a camera on a tripod, shaking 6 seconds before the collapse, running it now. And here is the shake right there. And 6 seconds later, large explosion at the top of the North Tower, and the building begins its descent. So the witness is the camera on a tripod that has been shaken at the same time the first responders are talking about explosions before the tower collapse. Here is, in this case, 10 seconds, World Trade Center, North Tower. This shake occurs, this camera is mounted higher up on a roof, and there's the shake. And 10 seconds later, after explosions on the top of this tower, this building begins to come down. So both of these tripod-mounted cameras producing evidence of the tremors, corroborating the first responders. How about the South Tower? We have, excuse me, 9:59 and 04 seconds is the beginning of the seismic event, but the tower doesn't start to collapse until 5 seconds before that, and the first debris doesn't start to hit the ground until 7 seconds after that. So what does NIST do with that discrepancy? I mean, the first debris, not even the heaviest debris, the first debris can't cause this shake. Well, NIST goes back to LDEO and gets them to move their data back yet again a fourth time, 3 seconds. We're not buying that. So what do we have? Yet another witness corroborating the first responders. The New York 1 camera is shaking here 3 seconds before the beginning of the tower's collapse. So let's look at it. And go. This shake is more subtle. That's the shake right there. And 3 seconds later, is it 3 seconds? The building comes down. Yeah, 3 seconds. And so we have some more problems here. The official narrative says that the seismic signals near the times of these collapses are due to the debris hitting the ground. We just disproved that. But even so, the debris isn't hitting the ground. We already saw that the concrete has been pulverized to a fine powder. We saw that the gypsum board did too. There's no seismic component at all from the concrete. We saw that the steel frame is shattered to individual wall units, just 4 to 8 tons each, which is relatively small, certainly, and peppering the ground over 15 seconds. And not even the ground, but a 7-story concrete basement structure. It's like a drum on the top of the surface. So these are not going to generate a signal 20 miles north. And they're equally diffused, peppering the ground and all around the outside, as we already saw, the perimeter of these buildings. Another problem, we have identical buildings and identical collapses, but producing very different results on the seismic scale. 2.1 for the South Tower versus 2.3 in the North Tower. Now that's 1.6 times greater energy due to the logarithmic scale that we use with the Richter scale that's associated with the Richter scale. So this is almost an order of magnitude larger. What could account for that? Certainly not the collapses, not the buildings. They're identical. So the only rational explanation is additional explosives. So Andre Rousseau declares identical buildings and nearly identical collapses can't possibly produce seismic events of extremely different energy releases on an order of magnitude. Well, all this evidence is very nicely summarized in the consensus 9/11, the 9/11 best evidence. Point TT, Twin Towers 7, why did the Twin Towers collapse? The seismic evidence. This is performed by Elizabeth Woodworth and David Ray Griffin. Very nicely on their website, consensus911.org. So now you know why, for instance, you cannot compare the controlled demolition of the Seattle Kingdom, in which a 25,000-ton concrete roof impacts the ground virtually at once, producing a 2.3 magnitude earthquake or event, to the Twin Towers, for all the reasons we just talked about. It's not comparing apples to apples whatsoever. So beware of people who do such comparisons. So Andre Rousseau is certainly one source that you want to look at here. Also, Graham McQueen, Did the Earth Shake Before the South Tower Hit the Ground? Craig Furlong, Seismic Proof. So very important work. And let's go to the NIST report. After all, NIST had objectives that were assigned to it by Congress in this $20 million effort. How and why World Trade Center 1 and 2 collapsed. How and why they collapsed. But NIST apparently had its own objective, which they actually wrote and hid in footnote 13 on page 82. The focus of the investigation was on the sequence of events from the instant of aircraft impact only up until the initiation of collapse. This is the probable collapse sequence. Wait a minute. They say it doesn't actually include the structural behavior of the tower after the conditions for collapse initiation were reached. Hold on. You have 10,000 pages and 4 years of work, and you only have a half a page on the actual collapse. You were tasked by Congress to tell us how and why the World Trade Center collapsed. Well, what did you give us in that half page? Speculation. The structure below the level of collapse initiation offered minimal resistance. The large building mass far exceeded the capacity of the intact structure below to absorb it. Came down essentially in free fall. Floors below were unable to arrest the moving mass. This is pure speculation. There's no analysis with supporting calculations. This is a pre-collapse report. It probably should have been titled The Final Report on the Initiation of Collapse of the World Trade Center. We submitted a request for correction, which you can do with agencies that commit fraud like this. We were unable to provide a full explanation of the total collapse of the Twin Towers. They write back, yeah, we completely agree. No analysis whatsoever. So when asked about this, by the way, they say, well, we found no corroborating evidence to suggest that explosives were used. A year later, they admit in writing, this did not test for the presence of explosive residue. Wait a minute. You can't find what you won't test for. Others did, by the way, and that's what next week is all about. So don't miss next week's part 3 of this 3-part series. And what do the experts say? At least those experts without financial or political obligations that might sway their objective opinion in the matter of whether these buildings came down by explosive demolition. William Rice, structural engineer. The prevailing theory would have us believe that each of the Twin Towers inexplicably collapsed upon itself, crushing all 287 massive columns on each floor, while maintaining a near free fall acceleration. As if the 80,000 or more tons of supporting structural steel framework underneath didn't even exist. David Scott, structural engineer. Near free fall collapse violates laws of physics. You can memorize that one. Scott Granger, memorize this one too. All 3 collapses were very uniform in nature. Natural collapses, due to unplanned events, are not uniform. He's a fire protection engineer. New Mexico Tech expert Van Romero, testing Energetic Materials Research Testing Center, New Mexico Tech. Explosive devices caused the collapse of both towers. It's too methodical to be a chance result of airplanes colliding with structures. After the planes hit the towers, there were some explosive devices inside the buildings that caused the towers to collapse. Apparently, he has succumbed to pressure and revoked this opinion, as they get most of their funding from federal sources. Same with Mathis Levy, who before he joined the FEMA team said this.
You've seen many of the managed demolitions where they implode a building and they cause it essentially to fall vertically because they cause all of the vertical columns to fail simultaneously. That's exactly what it looked like, and that's what happened.
And Ronald Hamburger, same thing. It appeared to me that charges had been placed in the building. Upon learning that no bombs had been detonated. Now, wait a minute. We just showed you like all kinds of evidence that bombs had been detonated. So somebody learned him, and he changed his story. Mike Taylor, Executive Director, National Association of Demolition Contractors. The collapse of the World Trade Center towers looked like a classic controlled demolition. They mirrored the strategy that was used by demolition experts. Andre Rousseau, even if the plane impacts on the fall of the debris from the towers on the ground could have generated seismic waves, their magnitude would have been insufficient to be recorded 20 miles north. Controlled demolition is confirmed and demonstrated. That's what the experts have to say. Well, surely the steel was saved in 3 of the most controversial building collapses in history. But no, listen to Abelhausen Astani Ozil, structural engineer, PhD, professor at Berkeley.
After 9/11, we realized that Port Authority of New York and New Jersey has sent all the steel that we need to study. That's why I'm here to study steel. Has sent all the steel to recycling plant to go to China for recycling. For what? For 15 cents a pound. Just nothing. And all the evidence of steel went to melting pot.
All the evidence of the steel went to the melting pot, to China, for recycling, prompting Bill Manning, editor-in-chief of Fire Engineering magazine, to cry out, crucial evidence that can answer many questions is on the slow boat to China, showing an astounding ignorance of government officials to the value of a thorough scientific investigation. The destruction and removal of evidence must stop immediately. But it didn't. We have 400 truckloads a day, starting just 2 weeks after 9/11, hauling this steel to the barges after the Fresh Kills landfill and send them to China for recycling. This is the illegal destruction of evidence in a crime scene, prompting so many to conclude, along with all the other evidence that we have and the use of the scientific method that we sought to achieve today, the hypothesis is corroborated. Well, which is it for you? Is it jet planes and fire, or is it explosions and controlled demolition? We want you to tell us. In fact, we've shown so far in part 2 of this 3-part series 8 characteristic and very uncharacteristic features of controlled demolition. Evidence of destruction from fire? No, fire doesn't create any of these features, let alone all of them. With additional circumstantial corroborative testimony, we find that to be proof of controlled demolition. But what do you find? Let Andy know. How can they do that, Andy?
Okay, please submit any questions that you might have in the input form we talked about earlier. That is at ae911truth.org. You go under continuing education and select the live webinars. You'll see the box, and we will do our best to answer them. In the meantime, we're going to tell you about some of the ways that you can get involved if now that you're informed, you agree this evidence is compelling and warrants a new investigation.
Thank you, Andy. While you're there, everybody, which is here, take time to subscribe to our email list, get the latest evidence that we're getting, our efforts that we're making toward getting a real investigation, and just stay with us, get informed. We have lots of evidence on our website, additional books and papers and DVDs and videos, extraordinary quantities of evidence. And do sign the petition. You can join the 3,400 architects and engineers demanding a new investigation, there's 20,000 others that support them. And certainly if you are an architect or engineer yourself, which means you have a degree after a diploma with the word engineer or architect on it, that can be very helpful to all of us in getting our numbers greater and the word out. While you're there, donate. We're a 501c3 nonprofit organization, and we're only supported by your small donations. So that's how we keep going, keep educating the public, the media, our congressional representatives, and the academic world. It takes all of us. And become a member for as little as a cup of coffee a month. That little cost, you can become a member, a sustaining supporter of AE 9/11 Truth. And we need you. If you can't do that, I encourage you to volunteer. How do they do that, Andy?
Yeah, the simplest way is go to ae911truth.org. There's a volunteer form right at the top of it. It's very easy to fill out, and that covers the how, but the why. Why should you do it? Because it's very important. As you can see, this is the most important issue that we have faced right now in this century, and this is the issue that wakes people up to a lot of things. But we need a lot of help to get that message out there. And of course, we're going to be doing a lot of things in the coming months to try to get this message to people that are politically active. So if you can just spare a few hours a week and you really want to work, then please fill out that form and we'll get you involved.
Thank you. And guess what? There it is. We have all these different teams you can help us on. So there's things you can do on your own too. You can contact your elected representatives, the media representatives. Send the ae911truth.org link to everyone you know, every architect and engineer you can find. Screen the DVDs to your friends and colleagues. Share them, and our brochures, which you can get in our store. 100 of them for $10. Give them out to people in your life. You can download the World Trade Center 7 finite element analysis report from the University of Alaska that concluded that Building 7, which we talked about last week, did not come down by fire as the NIST narrative would have us believe, but by the removal of all the columns at once in that building. Well, what can cause that? This is an extraordinary effort by Leroy Halsey, one of the top forensic structural engineers in the country. And we have produced a film about that effort and about him. So this is really worth watching. You can see it on Amazon.com. It's streaming right now. You can also get the DVD in our store at ae911truth.org. We have been trolling NIST with requests for correction, getting them to correct their fraudulent reports. And we're in the appeal process now with that. So stand by about that. There we go. Andy, why are we going to Congress?
Why are we going to Congress? Because despite the fact that a lot of people who are there because they are the type of people that don't rock the boat, we still are idealists, and we expect that we're going to get a full investigation that's going to yield exactly what Richard has been telling us, that those buildings were brought down with controlled demolitions on that day. But it takes action on behalf of constituents. So that is why we need you involved. One way is to get behind the Bobby McIlvaine Act. The World Trade Center Investigation Act is named after Bobby McIlvaine, who was killed in the North Tower as he was entering the lobby that morning by an explosion. His father has worked with us for years, and so we named the bill right after him. What it would do is it would create a select committee. It can be passed in either house of Congress that would look into exactly what Richard has been talking about. All of that evidence. They can't just go out and throw out NIST talking points. They actually have to look into evidence of controlled demolition at the towers on that day. So how do you get involved? Well, first go to ae911truth.org/justice. You can learn all about the act there. You can download a copy of the bill. And also, you can contact your member of Congress. Give them a call. Leave them a message, even if they don't answer the phone. Let them know that there's people in your community who are interested in this and want justice on this important issue. And of course, you can schedule a phone meeting with them as well. I believe we've sent out bulletins about that in the past. We just did a bulletin calling on people to send copies of 7 to the congressional office. So we're going to keep on knocking on that door until we get what we're asking for. And I believe that one day we are going to get it.
You bet we will. And we also have an effort to hire. Well, we've raised $100,000 to hire the best attorney in London to submit, who believes in our cause, to submit an application for a new inquest into the death of Jeff Campbell, who died of massive explosions. And that is going to be submitted imminently in the UK. So very exciting work being done there also. And if you want to see 40 high-rise architects, structural engineers, metallurgists, chemists, physicists, controlled demolition experts, all laying out this evidence themselves, you need to see our landmark documentary. I want to give you just a taste of it before we answer your questions here. Let's take a look at this.
I don't want to be involved in conspiracy theories. There are lots of them. They can go on. We can speculate on that forever. What we really need to know is how those buildings came down.
World Trade Center 7 collapsed because of fires fueled by office furnishings. It did not collapse from explosives or from fuel oil fires.
To undermine scientific integrity is to undermine our democracy.
This is what NIST has done, denied and ignored crucial evidence.
The American people absolutely need the truth of 9/11.
More than 1,500 architects and engineers and 12,000 others, including many scientists, have signed the petition calling for a scientific investigation of the destruction of the Twin Towers and World Trade Center Building 7. The report, issued by the National Institute of Standards and Technology, referred to as NIST, was not valid science.
They're talking about a single columnar collapse or failure that resulted in a total collapse of the building.
Building number 7 descended in free fall for the first 100 feet, which means that there was absolutely no resistance to the descent whatsoever.
So all of the columns really needed to be severed at the same time.
The symmetry is the smoking gun.
NIST has admitted it went into free fall for 8 stories.
You don't need to be an engineer or an architect to see what happened to those buildings.
Dit is controlled demolition. Zeker weten. Zeker weten.
What I saw, it was a classic implosion. The center of the core, the penthouse area, starts to move first, and then the building follows along with it.
NIST excluded the documents from FEMA in Appendix C that documented the evidence of melting steel.
In an office fire, you cannot generate enough heat to melt steel.
There were these iron microspheres present in all of the dust samples. They needed to have been formed in extremely high temperatures.
All the characteristics of the microspheres, along with what I see in the attack of the beams that were actually found, tell me that thermite was involved.
In the dust, what we have found is a modern version of thermite, which we call nanothermite.
NIST concedes that they found no evidence for explosives. So then we asked them, well, did you look? And they said, no, we did not look for explosives or residues of explosives.
And in fact, the evidence is overwhelming that these red-gray crystals are very high temperature incendiaries.
And we have watched as scientific integrity has been undermined and scientific research politicized in an effort to advance predetermined ideological agendas.
If this is a crime, I think everybody agrees it's a crime, Evidence was removed from the scene of the crime. You can't do science when you are deprived of the evidence and when your hypothesis is the least valid instead of the most likely. When the most likely hypothesis in the case of Building 7 wasn't even mentioned. This is not science.
You can get this DVD. You can watch it for free on YouTube, the 1 hour version. But I recommend you get the 90-minute version on DVD. Comes with a whole bonus disc with a whole lot more evidence from these from these experts in their subjects. And also the psychologists who just really help us to understand why this information is so difficult and how to reach people with it. You can download the booklet, 50 pages, beyondmisinformation.org. Go there, download it for free, or get the coffee table version and share that with important people in your sphere of influence. It's extraordinary. It pulls the rug out from underneath NIST and provides a lot of this evidence that you've been seeing today. Our classic lecture is free on YouTube, 9/11 Blueprint for Truth, and our 15-minute documentary on Building 7, narrated by actor Ed Asner, is also free on YouTube. Hey, we've arrived at the point where we want to answer some questions. Andy, do we have any?
Yes, we have 4 comments and questions today. The first one asks, today you have shown us all kinds of witnesses using the word explosion and one video with a huge sound of an explosion. NIST admitted that they never tested for explosives. They partially based this on their knowledge that there were no witnesses or video recordings of any sounds of explosions. Can we ask NIST if they had known about the numerous witnesses hearing explosions in the video with the sound of an explosion, if they then would have tested for explosives?
Well, we can certainly ask NIST such a question. We have asked them many questions. I don't doubt that that was one of them. But they simply refer us to their FAQ, very frequently asked questions. And they stand by, they always say they stand by their assertion that there were no explosions. And so they're caught between a rock and a hard place. This is a fraudulent response from an otherwise reputable organization, and they don't want to be caught in the act of covering up the crime of the century. So they do what they have to do, and we do what we have to do, which is our request for correction. And Andy, you have any other thoughts about this, answering this question?
It's a good angle, but they would probably just refuse to answer it and just focus on the fact that, or the assertion, because it's not a fact, that there was no evidence of explosions, and overlook the oral histories taken by the fire department that was outlining them. So they would probably just dodge it, but it is a good angle.
Yeah.
Okay, our next question asks, how many architects still refuse to vote for AE 911 resolution for a new investigation at AIA convention each year? It is absurd that a majority of professionals refuse to acknowledge truth.
We developed a resolution calling upon the AIA to support a new investigation into the destruction of these towers based on the evidence that you're seeing in this 3-part series, today being part 2 of 3. We took it, the first year we got 3% of the top level managers, if you will. About 300 of them come to this meeting every year. And 3% of them voted for a new investigation. The next year we got over 11% of them, which, so we thought we were doing really great. So we went back the third year, because you need, I think, at least half of them too. But at least we were getting some evidence out there as we were making this argument in this campaign to get them to vote for a new investigation. The next year we didn't do as well. So we also got a lot of backlash, and they took away our authority to provide certification for continuing education units for this course that you're listening to right now. So we lost that certification as well. So we just began to back off, realizing that that was like climbing one of the tallest sand dunes you can. You just weren't getting to the top. So I hope that helps. I do agree that it is absurd that a majority of professionals refuse to acknowledge this evidence. Making statements such as, this is not for architects, this is for engineers. Well, architects specify the fireproofing. And if you read the official report, this is all about the fireproofing and the adhesion of fireproofing to the steel. That's what we specify. That's our responsibility. If this building came down by fires due to the knocking off of the fireproofing off the steel by the jet plane impacts, which is the reason NIST had provided for the collapse of this building by fire, the vulnerability of the steel, then we're involved de facto. It's not just a structural engineering issue. But we're going to engineers all around the country now too. We've sent 75,000 postcards. We've given 40 presentations around the country, in person and virtual, and we're continuing to do that. So yeah, it's absurd that they aren't passing this information along like wildfire, like those in the 9/11 truth movement have been, like we are. But we're doing what we can.
Yeah, and I'll just add too, and I've been to a few of those conventions, and I really believe it's politics, because when people stood up to oppose one of the resolutions back in 2015, I believe it was, I mean, they said things that weren't even factually accurate about the fall of Building 7. I've told the story on my show about how one person tried to argue that there may have been a simultaneous earthquake at the time when Building 7 came down, and that could have contributed to its collapse. I mean, that would be horrible luck. But it's absurd. But that was an AIA architect that tried to argue that to me. So, I mean, we look at their credentials as an important thing to put behind our arguments and our evidence. But at the same time, they're just people. I mean, when I would see the AIA president at some party that was we weren't really invited. I think we just showed up to try to talk to him. But you might as well have been just watching any kind of federal politician working the room. And when you look at some of the speakers that they had lined up over years, I'm trying to come up with them off the top of my head, but I think Kevin Spacey was one of them that they were trying to get. Bill Clinton, members of the Bush administration. I'm not saying the AIA was in on it or anything, but they're trying to raise money. Was it Colin Powell? Okay, I couldn't remember if it was him or Condoleezza Rice. But, they want to get these big-time speakers, and you're not going to do that challenging the government on September 11th. So, I mean, these are the kind of factors that play into why cover-ups like this happen, and it's the reality that we have to deal with.
And also, the AIA, American Institute of Architects, of which I'm one of 90,000 members, did not see fit to issue even one bulletin on the worst structural failure in history, the third worst, due to fire. Not one bulletin. I mean, that's absolutely extraordinary state of events. No plane hit Building 7, and yet it came down in 7 seconds, as we saw last week, exactly like a controlled demolition. So they did not want to touch that, and that's fraud. That's just pure fraud and cover-up.
All right, and I'm going to get to the next question. There seems to be some questions going on YouTube about whether we are live or not. We are totally live right now, unless you're watching it later. But you should be able to tell by the way that the video is presented to you.
And now is March 11th, so at 1 to 3 p.m. If it's not that time, you're not watching it live.
Exactly. All right. It says any university that builds their multidisciplinary curriculum around this would attract droves of bright young minds wanting to solve this riddle. What do you think, Richard?
I would hope that would be the case. We do have a few people here and there that are interested in plugging away at the truth of this. I mean, look at the implications of 9/11. It's absolutely extraordinary. It changed everything. Any of us can be arrested. I mean, we're without a right to a lawyer, a trial, a jury. Any of us, we all are involved in paying for a $5.6 trillion global war on terror that 9/11 started, and that still continues. I mean, this is, we've got to get to the bottom of this. So the motivation is not just to figure out how these buildings really came down. We've kind of done that, right? And in this 3-part series, we will continue that next week. So, but it's fascinating technically, yes, but we owe it to our country, ourselves, our children and their children to get to the truth of what really happened here, because it's affecting them. They're going to be paying for it.
That's right. And of course, you have the greatest structural failures in modern history taking place on the exact same day. It seems like you could have an entire course in engineering. People are taking engineering as a major. You could have an entire course dedicated to this subject, but I have not heard of that yet, or at least nobody has ever told me of one. And they could explore these issues. They could explore the official story. I mean, I wouldn't even ask for them to bend it in our direction. Just explore it neutrally and see what the students come up with in terms of conclusions. That would be excellent.
Yeah.
All right, last question. It says, I heard they were spraying insulation into the property before the towers came down. Would it have been possible for an explosive or cutting agent to have been sprayed on instead of the insulation?
The excellent researcher Kevin Ryan, in his popular blog Dig Within, has an article on the renovations in the World Trade Center towers, both in the North and the South Tower, in which he documents that coincidentally, the floors, the 5 or so floors above and below the point of jet plane impacts in each of these towers, which were 15 floors difference in height, the jet plane impacts, the renovations for fireproofing were going on in the year before 9/11. Now, how extraordinary is that coincidence? Yes, it could have been under the guise of a fireproofing, and it could have been layered nanothermite, which we'll be looking at next week, because that's was applied with a fluid in multiple layers, as we'll see next week also. So, you put those two together and you get real suspicion. You got real reason and target for real journalism and investigation.
All right, and that is our last question today.
Okay, so what are we going to do? We're going to review what we've done today, which is the part 2, the Twin Towers explosive destruction. We saw the sudden near free fall collapse of these buildings, witnesses of explosions, evidence of explosions, high velocity lateral ejection, shattering of the steel frame, midair pulverization of the concrete. Where do we go from here? Next week, Thursday, 1 p.m. Pacific, we come back. We look at the extreme heat in the Twin Towers. And yes, we'll be looking at thermite, nanothermite, molten iron microspheres documented by all kinds of agencies. So this is an extraordinary exploration into the use of nanothermite, which is proof of how these towers came down. And high energy explosives is the body of evidence we were looking at today. And then we started all over again in April. We come back and begin on the first Thursday in April, part 1, World Trade Center Building 7, the 3rd tower to collapse. So come back and join us. And if you missed any of these, be sure to catch them for free on YouTube. Look them up. In the meantime, Subscribe to our channel so that you can get updates from us. Like the videos and comment below. Thanks so much. We'll see you guys soon. Bye for now.